took a moment. Now you're hearing giggles. One often hears stories similar to this from contemporary parents, from mother to mother. I believe almost every parent has had the experience at least once in their lives of a child wanders off, and even if just for a moment, that moment to a parent seems to last forever. Of course, these were different times in the Bible, simpler times, as we often say. It's always simpler times. Last year was a simpler time. The family heads out on an annual excursion to Jerusalem. It's about a 65-mile walk, a 3-day journey. They had to stop often for children, the young ones, and for the older ones that accompanied them. Practically the whole town went on this journey. They spend their days in Jerusalem for the festival, 6 or 7 days, and then set out to return home again. About a day into the journey, Mary realizes that Jesus is nowhere to be found. Martha Spong, a scholar, reflects on this and says it might have gone something like this in her imagination. She says, the whole family has been to Jerusalem, to the temple, traveling with friends and with neighbors. They made the journey together. Everyone keeps an eye on the children. Everyone. One of the mothers counts repeatedly. This way it relieves a burden from the other mothers who are on the journey. She hates to tell Mary. A good boy is missing could mean a boy in real trouble. Time matters. Has someone taken Jesus? She calls to his mother. I'm sure we can find him, she says, trying to be reassuring, but she can hear the sharp edge in Mary's voice as she calls out, Joseph, come quickly. And that's when people tell the mother to breathe, but she can't get a breath. Word spreads. Some go ahead in case he ran that way. Boys do run off, she says to Mary. Boys will be boys. Don't worry, not yet. That's what they say. Boys will be boys. Some go back, retracing the steps. Some look on the side of the road just in case he fell or worse. Mary's heart beats fast. How can a heart beat so fast? Joseph and Mary run back to Jerusalem. After 3 days, they find him at the temple, talking to the elders as if he knows what he's doing. He didn't know how they had worried. He lost track of time. He has work to do, his father's business. He is an unusual boy. Boys will be boys, and Jesus will be Jesus. You want to yell at them. And when they finally come home, you want to yell and cry, but you don't. You hug them, if they'll let you. Mary is unusual too. She takes these things and she keeps them. She keeps them in her heart. Julie Craig also reflects on this, saying, I understand Mary and Joseph's point of view. I know the frantic feeling of losing track of a child for a moment. I cannot imagine 3 sleepless nights and 3 terror-filled days of not knowing where my child was. As a mother, I have to say, I find Jesus' response to be not very godlike, but that of a sulky tween. Good heavens, child. I believe both these reflections can give us a more human perspective of Mary. Poor Joseph is just kind of really put to the sideline. He's there, but even when Jesus refers to his father, he's not talking about Joseph. I think that Luke may be trying to do a few things here, and the scholarly research seems to back me up. First, we hear language used at the end of the birth sequence for Luke. Jesus goes from birth to presentation at the temple for the naming, and then he says the child grew and became strong and filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was upon him. That's Luke 2:40. That was Jesus as a baby. And that goes right to where we are now. We have Jesus as a boy, and his passage ends in a similar way again, saying Jesus increased in wisdom and in years and in favor with God and humankind alike. Now, we know that Jesus actually had a childhood. That's what this shows us. This is the only canonical writing that says that Jesus had a childhood. There are no other accounts until Jesus' ministry starts. And I couldn't help but wondering, does this story serve any purpose besides showing that Jesus had a life somewhere between birth and ministry? And if so, what is being shown? I see a young boy Though not so young for those days, he was about to enter manhood officially. He is also fully aware of his role and basically admonishes his mother for not assuming where he would be. It would seem Mary forgot. Really? Do you think Mary could forget what was said in the prophecies concerning Jesus? I mean, the angel, the cousin, Simeon, and Anna, and that is just in the book of Luke. Do you think Mary could forget the visitations from the scholars from the east? Forget the even lowly shepherds were stopping by to see the baby? Do you believe Mary simply shrugged off Joseph's dreams and their flight into Egypt and then back again? If one adds all this up, this makes Jesus' admonishment even more ungodly-like. Ungodly-like only if you forget that one phrase here. Mary kept all these things in her heart. This is not only said after this passage, but also right after the shepherds left. Mary, for Luke, is a record keeper. She doesn't proclaim all these things, but keeps them in her heart. After all, she doesn't want Jesus to get a big head. The parallel here in the story is also drawn to the death of Jesus. There is a similarity. This would not have gone past any of the first century readers who heard the story. Jesus is missing for 3 days, and Mary and Joseph are looking for him. Just as they looked for Jesus in the tomb but was not there, for he had risen. So it might be a little bit of foreshadowing. Something else interesting here is Jesus is basically holding his own in the ancient tradition of Jewish teaching. Jesus is seated with the scholars, and they are posing questions to him, and he is answering and posing questions to them. Another scholar describes it this way. Probably in one of the many chambers, which tradition says were built against the wall of the temple, so little cubicles, little enclosures that opened up to the temple courts. The sacred secret which they knew concerning the child should have sent them at once to the temple seeking for him. Instead, he was sitting. Jewish scholars sat on the ground as the teacher sat around them in their midst. The school he was at, in which they taught, were usually schools that most the kids their parents had to pay for. So somehow he snuck in and got in for free. We don't know how that happened. And this is not to be confused with the scribes. These are actual teachers and scholars. The scribes are people who just copied things. So Jesus is both hearing them and asking them questions. He was not teaching. They don't expect kids to teach. He was among them as modest scholar, not as a forward child. The rabbinical method of instruction was to state cases or problems bearing upon the interpretation of the application of the law, which cases or problem were to be solved by the pupils. Anybody ever see Yentl? You know, they're sitting around with all sorts of texts, and all they're doing is arguing about what one word might even mean, let alone what a sentence means. This is the type of place where they found Jesus, just wise men, scholars, knowledgeable in the tradition, and those who want to learn, and the back and forth, and how does it apply to today. And all that heard him were astonished at his understanding and his answers. And when his parents saw him, they were astonished. Mary and Joseph stood much in awe of these renowned national teachers, as peasants would stand in awe of a king. And there was their son just sitting among them casually doing what the other kids were doing. This may be Luke trying to give us a glimpse of the human and God in one. Jesus, being the Christ, could hold his own with the best of them, and of course, as a young man, he is no threat. He's simply a joy. Jesus, being a young man, thought nothing of sitting down and engaging in conversation, assuming his parents knew where he was without telling them, and that's actually about anything a typical teenager would do. I know a few times I took off and forgot to tell mom and dad where I was going, and I just assumed they knew where I was. In this analysis of Luke, we find Jesus, a young man, fully living into his teenagerhood and yet being fully divine, and unfortunately for his parents at this time, It's not very compatible. We also may take an impression that it is truly not his time yet. For the passage tells us that Jesus increased in wisdom over the years. So he wasn't where he needed to be yet. He still had more learning and experiencing to do. In Ministry Matters, one of the many resources I use, there's a prayer that states, Lord, you know our confusion this day, when the gospel reflects that moment in Jesus' life when he found in the temple, learning from the teaching of the elders. We haven't really gotten over the mystique of Christmas yet, the birth, and the angels, and the shepherds, and suddenly today we are just tossed out for this moment into this scene. And we're not really ready for this yet. We're not ready for Jesus to be a 12-year-old boy. We want to keep him a baby, like here in the scene. We want, like worried parents of Jesus, we are frightened by his disappearance maybe. Why weren't his parents more diligent? Why didn't they know where he would be? When Joseph and Mary found Jesus, they were upset. They wanted to know how he could do this and be so thoughtless. But he responded rather cryptically in a message about his being in his Father's house. And what did that mean? What did that mean? What does that mean to us? We come to this building for this time of worship, and we say we are in God's house. And for this time, we feel a sense of the Spirit, of presence, of God. But then we go back to the real world. And we lose that feeling. God's house is our very selves. God makes God's home in each of our lives, as I told you in the centering prayer reflection. The gathering time we have and the call to worship here is a time to remind ourselves of God's abiding love and to celebrate with each other God's infinite presence and challenge to be part of God's community. Open our hearts this day, we pray, to understand our loving presence and God's loving challenge to us. Make us ready to serve. Don't be looking back at Christmas. Don't be looking forward to Easter. Be present in today in the Spirit and what Christ is trying to reach out and teach us, to move us. This passage reminds us many ways about this season. Maybe we did take the time to pay attention to things around us. Maybe we did slow down to see God in this world, in this messy, messy world. And perhaps we did make room for the Christ child in the spirit of the season. It was allowed to invade our hearts and infuse joy into our every moment. But now, that day's gone. And many spend the rest of the year trying to get that feeling back. Others are off to focus on Mardi Gras and get ready for Lent and then Easter Sunday. Then we are off for the summer until we have to prepare for Christmas again. If we find ourselves moving from holiday to holiday, moving from point A to point B, only to pause in that moment and then move on again, we have left the baby on the bus. I didn't leave the title behind. Or more appropriately, maybe we have left the baby in the manger. There you see the concept of the angels singing, the Christ child arriving, the shepherds and the wise men brought to their knees, the whole thing of Joseph and Mary desperately looking for Jesus, and is all about Jesus just casually reminding us he's about God's business and we should be too. I'm going to quote Dickens now. "But you were always a good man of business, Jacob," faltered Scrooge, who now began to apply this to himself. "Business," cried the ghost, wringing its hands again. "Mankind was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The deals of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business." I couldn't resist this. For what Marley is saying, what Jesus, the young man, is saying to me, is we should be about our Creator's business. For Jesus at this time, it was to learn and grow in wisdom. For you, it may be something different. You see, the business of being human is to do it in an engaged way. That it is always God's business. if we just take a moment to remember, whatever it is we are participating in, wherever we are. You see, even for Joseph and Mary, the problem was that they were engrossed in their own business. Now, there was nothing intrinsically wrong with that. They had been doing what they had been doing. They had been obeying the law and going to worship God at the temple. They were being very religious, but in their attempt to fulfill the requirements of God's law, they lost the one and only Christ. Why? Because they were involved with the journey home. This wasn't a priority at the moment. They were counting on other people to be doing it for them. They left Jesus behind because they were distracted by getting home. How easy it is to be distracted from God's priorities. We fill our lives with all sorts of good things, just like Joseph and Mary did, but we leave Jesus behind because even these good things aren't necessarily God's priorities. The starting pistol fires and we're off doing our thing and we just leave Jesus behind doing God's thing. Now, our thing and God's things may be the same thing, or better yet, can be the same thing if we make it so. As long as we make a conscious decision to welcome God into our daily lives, not just Christmas or Easter, not just an hour on Sunday. This is about prayerfully allowing God to be part of your day-to-day. As you go about your daily business and being you, take the time. Take a moment to just check in. Say, God be with me, or thank you, God, or I know you're with me, God. Now, I'm going to suggest something even more radical than that. It's very scary for some people, but if you took a half a day or a whole weekend and made it a spiritual retreat, made a time quarterly, what would that do to your life? If you gave God a half a day or a whole weekend to be alone, meditate, to check in how God is moving you, shaping you, what God is calling you to do, what God is preparing you for, maybe something new, maybe something different, maybe the same old thing in a different way, maybe the same old thing in the same old way. Is God calling you to keep doing what you're doing, but maybe a bit more diligent about it? Is God drawing you into something deeper, maybe something more spiritual? We live in a very rich area here in Los Angeles, and there are opportunities for private retreats. There are opportunities to take time and do your own thing by the ocean or in the woods or up in the mountains. There are places to go for silence or for guidance. I can name 3 different retreat centers right off the top of my head that are all within maybe an hour's drive at the most. And some are even closer. They have planned programs throughout the year. If you take the time to investigate, you might find something that calls to you. They also have places where they allow people to make their own retreats silently. There are churches and organizations with hundreds of planned events, if one seeks them out. Still Point in California has many day retreats and lectures that participate from story writing to art projects to just wonderful lectures and days of prayer. The Catholic missions, besides being historical and often tourist attractions, have some of the most beautiful grounds to just walk and be silent with God. Or go easier. The path around the lake at Echo Park is available all day and all night. And it's not only interesting to watch the people go by, but it is a very peaceful place. I think this is an opportunity to see the baby Jesus arrive, see a panicked parent trying to keep their baby, though he has become a young man, and our own panic of just trying to live, all incorporated into one story. The story of Jesus from beginning to end is about connecting ourselves to our humanity and connecting that to our spirituality. We often separate the two. Here's our daily life, and Sunday for an hour is for God. That is if I have time and nothing better is on TV and my team isn't playing and the roast doesn't have to get done and nobody's coming to visit today. And But Jesus, God came into this world a child, fully human and fully alive and fully God, to teach us how to be fully human and fully alive and fully connected to God. We are being called to stop panicking and running to seek for God and discover that God is with us, Emmanuel. That's what the word means, God among us. God is with us. You know, Handel's Messiah quotes the psalm, and it says, "For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace." This prayer does not say was. It says is, meaning it is as important today as it was then. It's a very much a present, a here and now thing. We must stop seeking God and allow ourselves to be in God and of God and about God's business, whatever that may be for you. Amen.